In the chaos of the Pacific War, every word could mean life or death. Across the islands, American commanders faced a nightmare. Japanese intelligence was intercepting and deciphering their transmissions faster than they could send them. Orders meant for one battalion often ended up in enemy hands. Battles were lost before they began. Then, out of the desert lands of the American Southwest came a solution no machine could match: a human code. It was built not from numbers or ciphers, but from a language few outside its people had ever heard: the Navajo tongue. By 1942, young Navajo men were training in total secrecy to send battlefield messages faster and more securely than anyone on Earth. To the enemy, their words were meaningless. To the Marines, they were victory itself. The Japanese called it magic. The Americans called it classified. History would remember it as the Unbreakable Code, and the men who spoke it as the silent heroes of World War II. When the Pacific War began in 1941, the United States was fighting an enemy that had mastered the art of listening. Japanese intelligence officers were among the best code breakers in the world. They had cracked British naval systems, intercepted U.S. communications across the Pacific, and turned captured American codes into deadly traps. At Midway, it was U.S. code breaking that changed the war. But before that turning point, Japan's cryptologists held the advantage. Every transmission sent by radio carried risk. American forces moved across thousands of miles of ocean and island, and every message had to pass through the air. Invisible, vulnerable, exposed. Encryption systems were slow and cumbersome. The enemy often decoded messages faster than the Americans could act on them. The result was chaos, confusion, and unnecessary bloodshed. In early 1942, the Marine Corps faced a crisis. They needed a new kind of code, something fast, reliable, and above all, impossible to decipher. Machine ciphers were not enough. The Japanese had already proven they could capture codebooks or mimic radio procedures. What they could not capture, however, was something that existed only in the human mind. The idea came from an unlikely source: a civil engineer named Philip Johnston, the son of a missionary who had grown up on the Navajo reservation in Arizona. Johnston was one of the few non-Navajos fluent in the language. He had seen firsthand how complex and unique it was. Navajo was unlike any European tongue. Its syntax was fluid, its tones subtle, and its meaning deeply tied to culture and tradition. There was no written alphabet. Few outside the tribe could understand even a single phrase. During World War I, Native American soldiers from other tribes, Choctaw, Comanche, and Cherokee, had already used their languages for simple battlefield codes. Johnston believed the Navajo could take that idea further and make it unbreakable. In February 1942, Johnston approached the U.S. Marine Corps with his proposal. The reaction was skeptical. Could an ancient tribal language really protect modern military communications? Johnston organized a test. In a single afternoon, he changed the course of the war. 2 teams of Navajo speakers were given identical English messages. One team translated them into Navajo and transmitted the message across the radio to the other team, who decoded it back into English, all in less than 30 seconds. The standard mechanical encryption systems took hours. The Marine officers were stunned. The demonstration proved what technology could not: that the human mind could be faster, safer, and more creative than any machine. The Corps authorized a top-secret experiment: the creation of a Navajo Code School at Camp Pendleton. 29 young Navajo men, many barely out of high school, were recruited in total secrecy. They called themselves the Original 29. Their task was extraordinary: to build a military code based on their language, but disguised so that even a fluent Navajo speaker could not understand it without training. Over weeks, they created a dictionary of more than 400 words, assigning Navajo terms to weapons, commands, and tactics. A submarine became Beshlo, or ironfish. A battleship was Loche, whale. A bomber was Jaysho, buzzard. What emerged was not just a code, and it was a linguistic weapon, one born of centuries of tradition and perfected in months of secrecy. When the first class graduated in the spring of 1942, the code was ready. The men were sent to the Pacific. There, their voices would soon carry orders for some of the most brutal battles in human history. The first 29 Navajo Code Talkers deployed to the Pacific in the summer of 1942, Their destination, Guadalcanal, an island that had already become a graveyard for men and machines. The Marines who landed there faced Japanese troops dug deep into the jungle and an enemy that listened to every transmission. Radio operators were constantly changing frequencies and codes, trying to stay ahead of interception. Messages often arrived too late to matter. The arrival of the Navajo men changed that overnight. Their code, swift, precise, and utterly indecipherable, began to move through the airwaves like a ghost. To the Japanese, it was as though the Americans had begun speaking in riddles. To the Marines on the ground, it was a revelation. At first, the code was used cautiously. Short messages, coordinates, status reports. But as the campaign intensified, commanders realized its true power. Code talkers could transmit a full page of tactical data in under 2 minutes, without a single error. Japanese cryptologists, some of the best trained in the world, couldn't make sense of a single line. Lieutenant General Seizo Arisue, one of Japan's leading intelligence officers, later admitted that his teams had recorded hours of intercepted transmissions. They believed it to be some new form of encryption. None ever broke it. It was like listening to ghosts, one officer said after the war. For the Navajo men, the experience was surreal. They had grown up in remote reservations, herding sheep under the vast skies of Arizona and New Mexico. Now they found themselves speaking their language, one their ancestors had been punished for using in American schools, to save American lives. At first, many of the Marines around them didn't understand what they were doing. To outsiders, their rapid exchanges of syllables sounded like chanting or code gibberish. But when messages began to reach artillery batteries and frontline commanders faster and more accurately than ever before, the skepticism vanished. The code talkers were assigned to every Marine division across the Pacific. Their duties were grueling. They worked without sleep, often under fire, crouched in foxholes or behind radios while artillery thundered around them. Their mission was simple: keep the code alive no matter the chaos. In the thick jungles of Guadalcanal, the system proved itself again and again. When Japanese infiltrators cut telephone lines or seized codebooks, the Navajo transmissions continued unaffected. Each message was improvised, fluid, built from human understanding rather than written symbols. As the war expanded across the Pacific, the Navajo network grew. More recruits joined from the reservations, trained in total secrecy at Camp Pendleton. By 1943, more than 200 code talkers were operating in the field. Each had memorized hundreds of terms and their English equivalents. There were no written records. Every bit of the system lived inside their minds. The Japanese tried everything. Linguists were sent to study Native American languages and captured documents, believing they might find a pattern. They never did. No native speaker outside the trained corps could interpret the code, and even among the Navajo, dialects and word substitutions made it impossible to guess the system's meaning. Back in Washington, the Navajo Code was classified as top secret. Only a handful of senior officers even knew it existed. Not even the U.S. Army or Navy was initially informed. The Marine Corps wanted to keep its secret weapon to itself. By the end of 1942, the experiment had become a cornerstone of Allied communications. From the beaches of the Solomons to the coral reefs of Tarawa, messages flashed between ships and shore in a language older than the United States itself. What had begun, as an idea from one man, had become a code no empire could break and the quiet weapon of a people who had once been silenced. By 1943, the Navajo Code Talkers were no longer an experiment. They were a weapon, as vital as any rifle, as secret as any bomb. Their voices carried across the Pacific, linking fleets and regiments, planes and artillery, island to island, battle to battle. The system they used was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Each Navajo word represented a letter, a concept, or a military term. But it was more than substitution. It was layered, poetic, alive. Words changed meaning depending on the sentence, the rhythm, and even the speaker. A machine could not replicate it. A linguist could not untangle it. In the field, the code talkers were everywhere. At Guadalcanal, they directed artillery fire through the jungle. At Tarawa, they sent coordinates under constant sniper fire. At Bougainville, they relayed requests for reinforcements faster than any wire operator could type. Their speed astonished the officers who heard them work. One Marine radio operator described it as watching two minds move at lightning. Another recalled that the messages were so quick that even trained clerks could barely write fast enough to keep up. At headquarters, officers realized what they had: an invisible communication network that the enemy could hear but never understand. It allowed entire Marine divisions to coordinate land, air, and sea operations without delay or fear of interception. The result was decisive. Battles that once depended on luck and timing now moved with precision. The Japanese, for all their brilliance in cryptography, were powerless. They recorded transmissions, charted patterns, and studied speech rhythms. Some even suspected the code was based on a secret dialect or an ancient Asian language, but no amount of listening brought them closer to the truth. The closest they ever came was during the Bougainville campaign in late 1943, when a captured American radio operator mentioned Indian talkers. Tokyo's linguists scoured archives and even sent agents to study Native American languages from old anthropology records. The effort collapsed before it began. The complexity of Navajo was simply too great. Unlike other indigenous languages, Navajo was tonal, flexible, and rich with metaphor. A single word could carry multiple meanings based on pitch and placement. To translate it required not only vocabulary but cultural intuition. Even among Navajos, complete fluency was rare. This made the code almost magical. It could only exist between two men who understood not just the words, but the world they came from. Inside the Marine Corps, however, the code talkers were still treated as regular radio operators. They wore the same uniforms, fought in the same foxholes, and faced the same dangers. Their work remained classified, so few outside their immediate units even knew what they were doing. Many white Marines simply called them the Indians. But among the men who relied on their voices in the heat of battle, respect grew fast. A Marine sergeant at Tarawa once said, "When I heard them on the line, I knew the message would get through. Didn't matter if the rest of the world was listening, only we could understand." To the code talkers themselves, the work carried deep meaning. For generations, the Navajo people had endured forced assimilation, cultural bans, and punishment for speaking their language. Now that same language was saving lives. It was an act of redemption through service, a way to honor their ancestors and their nation at once. One of the original 29, Chester Nez later recalled, "In boarding school, they beat us for speaking Navajo. In the war, they gave us medals for it. That's the story of our people." The irony was not lost on them. Despite the secrecy, stories of their effectiveness began to spread quietly through the ranks. Commanders began to request code talkers for key operations. The system became a hallmark of Marine communication doctrine. By 1944, there were more than 400 Navajo code talkers active. Across the Pacific as the Marines prepared for the next great offensive, the assault on the Mariana Islands, the code talkers would face their greatest test yet. The scale of the operation, the complexity of coordination, and the sheer chaos of modern amphibious warfare would push their system to its limits. But the Navajo Code would not break. Not once. For the Japanese, who prided themselves on their intelligence networks, it was an unsolvable mystery. For the Americans, it was the silent link that bound their armies together. The war in the Pacific was about to reach its most brutal stage, and the words of the Navajo would carry through every explosion, every landing, and every order to come. By mid-1944, the Pacific War had become a series of brutal stepping stones, island to island, beach to beach, each one bloodier than the last. The United States had developed a rhythm of warfare: naval bombardment, amphibious landing, jungle fighting, and radio coordination. At the heart of that rhythm were the code talkers. They were everywhere, from the beaches of Saipan to the volcanic ridges of Iwo Jima. Their voices became the unseen pulse of Marine operations. Every artillery adjustment, every airstrike, every unit movement passed through their language. On Saipan, the code was tested on a scale no one had imagined. The landings involved more than 70,000 Marines, sailors, and soldiers. Radio chaos was constant, dozens of units trying to talk at once under bombardment and sniper fire. Yet the Navajo operators maintained perfect clarity. They sent and received over 800 messages in 2 days without a single mistake. Japanese intelligence officers listening nearby grew desperate. They intercepted hundreds of transmissions, logged them, analyzed frequencies. Nothing made sense. It was like birds singing, one captured officer said later. Fast, loud, impossible to follow. As the war intensified, the code talkers adapted. They invented new terms for new weapons and tactics. A flamethrower became the man with fire, a tank was turtle, a hand grenade was potato. These translations were poetic, simple and precise, drawn from a worldview that blended nature, metaphor, and military necessity. The code was alive. It evolved as the war did. By the time of Iwo Jima in February 1945, the Navajo Code Talkers had become indispensable. The invasion was one of the most ferocious in American history. 36 days of constant combat on a barren island where nowhere was safe. Japanese defenses were hidden in tunnels, caves, and bunkers. Communication failures could mean annihilation. Major Howard Connor, the signal officer of the 5th Marine Division, placed 6 Navajo Code Talkers at command posts across the front. For the first 48 hours, they worked without rest, sending more than 800 messages, all without error. Connor later said, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." It was not an exaggeration. Their code allowed artillery, infantry, and naval gunfire to coordinate in real time, something impossible through standard encryption. In the smoke and chaos of Iwo Jima, their language became the invisible structure holding the battle together. At the same time, Japanese commanders were still convinced they could find the key. They brought in linguists, code experts, and even scholars of Native American culture. None could break a single message. The more they studied, the less they understood. The irony was profound. The Japanese military, steeped in centuries of discipline and modern technology, was being defeated by the spoken rhythm of a people once dismissed as primitive by the very nation they now fought for. The Navajo Code Talkers didn't see themselves as heroes. They were Marines first, warriors who shared foxholes and rations like everyone else. But among their peers, they earned a different kind of respect, and quiet, genuine, unspoken. One Marine radio operator recalled watching 2 Navajo men work during the invasion of Okinawa. They sat back to back, one speaking, one writing, shells falling around them. The sound of their voices was calm, like they were back home talking about the weather. I realized that was what victory sounded like. By war's end, more than 400 Navajo Code Talkers had served in every major Marine campaign in the Pacific. Not one code transmission was ever deciphered. Not one message was lost. They had done what no machine, cipher, or algorithm could do. They had hidden meaning in plain sound, carried through the air by men who spoke a language born long before radio existed. The Japanese never knew what they were hearing. They only knew that every time the strange voices spoke, another island fell. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, the Navajo Code Talkers went home quietly. Their work remained classified for decades. No one outside military intelligence knew that an ancient language had helped win a modern war. For the Code Talkers, it didn't matter. They had done their duty. They had spoken for their people, for their nation, and for every Marine who owed his life to a message that reached him in time. Their code had survived the war, and so had they. When the war in the Pacific reached its final year, the balance of power was no longer in doubt. Japan was retreating on every front. Its once mighty fleet lay at the bottom of the sea, its skies filled with American aircraft, its armies cut off and surrounded. Yet one mystery still lingered inside Japan's intelligence circles: the American code they had never broken. Throughout the war, Japanese cryptologists had cracked nearly every system they encountered: Army codes, Navy signals, even diplomatic ciphers. But this one was different. They had recorded it for years, short bursts of sound, rapid and melodic, filled with syllables and rhythm unlike anything in Asia or Europe. They called it the Code of Wind. After the war, captured Japanese intelligence officers would finally learn the truth. The unbreakable code that had haunted them was not a machine. It was a language, one older than the nation that had defeated them. While Japan's war effort collapsed in flames, the Navajo Code Talkers continued transmitting until the very end. On Okinawa, they guided airstrikes and coordinated artillery fire under conditions so violent that radios burned from heat and shrapnel. One code talker described working through days of bombardment, his hands trembling from concussion and exhaustion. "We kept talking. We couldn't stop. If we stopped, men would die." When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, the war's end came suddenly. Across the Pacific, Marines listened in disbelief as word spread. Japan had surrendered. For the Code Talkers, the silence that followed was strange. After years of constant communication, the airwaves were still. Their mission was over. But their story had only just begun, or rather, it would not begin for decades. When the war ended, every aspect of the Navajo Code remained classified. The Marine Corps declared it a matter of national security, fearing it might be needed again. The Code Talkers were ordered to keep silent, not to tell their families, their friends, or even other veterans what they had done. They obeyed without hesitation. Their discipline was the same as it had been on the battlefield. Duty first, recognition later. For 25 years, they carried the secret in silence. During that time, America changed. The world moved into the Cold War. The story of the Pacific faded into textbooks and parades. Yet on the reservations of the Southwest, hundreds of men who had once held the most secure code in military history returned to lives of quiet obscurity. Many went back to herding, ranching, and working in schools or factories. Few spoke of the war. When asked about their service, they said only that they had been Marines. The irony was cruel. The very language they had once been punished for speaking in American boarding schools, the language that had saved thousands of lives, was again unspoken, hidden behind orders stamped top secret. But among the Marines who had fought beside them, the memory never faded. Officers who had witnessed the code in action told stories quietly at reunions and veterans gatherings. They spoke of calm voices in chaos, of messages that moved faster than thought, of lives saved by syllables no one else could understand. One Marine officer, years later, summarized it simply. When the Code Talkers spoke, I stopped worrying. I knew the message was safe. The secrecy surrounding their work began to lift only in the late 1960s, when the military finally declassified the program. By then, many of the original Code Talkers had grown old. Some had passed away without ever being thanked. When the truth finally reached the public, it shocked historians and veterans alike. The unbreakable code that had guided the Marines across the Pacific had not been invented in laboratories or universities. It had come from the sacred language of a people who had once been forced to hide it. In 1968, the United States officially recognized the Navajo Code Talkers for their service. But even then, the full story was only beginning to be told. They had changed the course of the Pacific War, but they had also changed something deeper: the way America saw its own diversity, its own contradictions, and its own forgotten heroes. For the Japanese cryptologist who had spent years trying to unravel the mystery, the revelation came as a mix of disbelief and admiration. Some reportedly smiled when told the truth. One said it was a language. No wonder we could not win. The wind had carried their voices across the world, and no empire had been able to silence them. When the Navajo Code Talker program was finally declassified in 1968, a silence of 25 years broke like a wave. Across reservations in Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, old men who had lived ordinary lives began to receive letters from historians, military officers, and fellow Marines. Many didn't understand why. Then the truth came out. The world finally knew what they had done. The same men who had been told to forget were now being asked to remember. For decades, they had carried the secret quietly, believing it was just another duty completed. Some were reluctant to speak at all. Others were overwhelmed by emotion. Families learned that the fathers and grandfathers who had said almost nothing about the war had helped shape its outcome. One of the original 29, Chester Nez, said in an interview years later, "When they told us it was secret, we never talked. I didn't even tell my wife. For a long time, I thought maybe nobody would ever know. But that's all right, we knew what we did." Recognition came slowly and then all at once. Veterans organizations invited them to speak. Schools asked for their stories. For the first time, their language, once banned from classrooms, was celebrated in them. The irony was not lost on anyone. The very words once labeled uncivilized had helped save civilization. In 1982, President Ronald Reagan declared August 14th, National Navajo Code Talkers Day. For the men who had lived through the war's silence, it was a moment of quiet vindication. But they never saw themselves as heroes. They always pointed back to their fallen comrades, the ones who had died sending messages, the ones whose names never appeared in any book. The recognition, however, was more than ceremonial. It became symbolic of a broader truth, that America's strength in war had come not only from its weapons, but from its diversity, from the fusion of cultures, languages, and identities that the world had underestimated. The story of the Navajo Code Talkers became a bridge between worlds, between Native America and the nation that had once tried to erase it. Their service forced the country to confront a paradox, that the same government which had suppressed native languages now owed its survival to one. In the 1990s, surviving code talkers began traveling to schools and museums telling their stories. They spoke humbly, often with pauses and long silences. Some still carried the weight of memories they could not easily share. Friends lost, fear remembered, the loneliness of being the only ones who could speak the code in the midst of battle. At military academies, their methods were studied and not for use but for admiration. Historians calculated the impact of their work. Thousands of lives saved, countless missions secured, entire campaigns held together by their words, and yet, what mattered most to the code talkers themselves was not the medals, but the restoration of dignity to their people. The language that had been beaten out of them in childhood had become their greatest contribution to the world. In 2001, decades after the end of the war, the United States Congress awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to the original 29 Navajo Code Talkers, and silver medals to the hundreds who followed. Some were already gone. The few who remained stood quietly in the Capitol, their hair silver, their voices steady, their eyes reflective. When one of them was asked what the medal meant to him, he answered softly, "It means they finally heard us." For Japan, the mystery they could never solve had become part of military legend, studied by cryptographers as an example of the perfect human code. For America, it became a story of redemption, a reminder that the nation's strength had always come from those who gave even when forgotten. By the early 2000s, fewer than a dozen code talkers were still alive. Each year their numbers dwindled, but their voices remained, in recordings, in classrooms, in ceremonies, in the memory of a war that once filled the world with noise. They had carried the most powerful weapon of World War II not in their hands, but in their hearts, a living code built from culture, history, and survival. And long after the radios fell silent, the world was still listening. In the years after the war, the story of the Navajo Code Talkers became more than military history. It became a symbol of resilience, identity, and reconciliation. Their voices, once secret, began to echo across generations. By the mid-20th century, the United States stood on the edge of new wars. Korea, then Vietnam, and the military sought to adapt the lessons of the past. The Navajo Code itself was never reused, but its principles lived on: simplicity, human adaptability, and cultural ingenuity. Military cryptologists studied it as a model of organic encryption, proof that a living, spoken system could outperform machines when trust and context aligned perfectly. But for the Navajo people, the aftermath was far more personal. Many code talkers returned to reservations that still struggled with poverty and discrimination. Their medals came decades later, but their lives after the war were marked by the same quiet dignity they had shown in combat. They built schools, served as tribal leaders, raised families, and spoke little of what they had done. Some suffered silently from what we now recognize as trauma: the sounds of battle, the smell of burning earth, the endless static of the radio. These memories lingered. For men who had been trained to communicate constantly, silence could be unbearable. And yet, when they did speak, it was often in gratitude, for survival, for language, for the chance to return home. On the reservations, elders began to see their story as more than military heroism. It became a parable of endurance. The language that had once been suppressed had now saved thousands of lives. In schools that had once forbidden native speech, children were now encouraged to learn it. The code had given back what assimilation had tried to take away: pride and identity. In the broader American consciousness, the code talkers helped shift the way the nation viewed its indigenous citizens. They became a living argument against the myth of the vanishing Indian. Their contribution was proof that native heritage was not a relic, but a strength, something timeless and vital that could shape even the most modern of wars. By the 1970s and 1980s, native language preservation programs began to appear across the United States. Linguists worked with tribal elders to document endangered dialects before they were lost. Many credited the Code Talkers' story for sparking that movement. If the Navajo tongue could help win a world war, what other wisdom might lie hidden in the words of America's First Nations? At the same time, the story of the Code Talkers entered classrooms, museums, and film. Documentaries and exhibits brought their history to audiences far from the deserts of the Southwest. The sight of old Marines in their red and gold caps, standing straight, eyes sharp, voices steady, became an enduring image of humility and strength. Even the U.S. Marine Corps, famed for its toughness and tradition, adopted the Code Talkers as part of its identity. Modern Marines are taught their story during training, not just as history, but as a lesson in trust, discipline, and innovation. When asked why the code had never been broken, one surviving Code Talker smiled and said, "Because it wasn't just words. It was our way of seeing the world. You can't decode that. Their code had ended a war, but its real legacy was peace. The peace that comes from being heard, from being seen, from knowing that the world finally understood what their ancestors had always known. That language is power." As the 20th century drew to a close, the legacy of the Navajo Code Talkers reached far beyond the battlefields where it was born. Their story, once buried in classified files, became part of a larger reckoning, a recognition that America's strength had always come from those it once overlooked. Across the country, memorials began to rise. In Window Rock, Arizona, the capital of the Navajo Nation, a bronze statue was unveiled in 2001. It showed a young Marine crouched over his radio, speaking into his handset with quiet resolve. The plaque beneath read, "In honor of the Navajo Code Talkers, the voices that carried victory." For many families, the monument was more than a tribute. It was closure. It was proof that their fathers and grandfathers had not vanished into history's shadows. They had shaped it. Ceremonies followed across the Southwest. Code Talkers were honored in parades, invited to the White House, and introduced to generations who had never known their names. But what moved them most were the visits to schools, where Navajo children, once punished for speaking their language, now stood proudly to hear it spoken by heroes. Those moments captured what the war had truly given back: identity. In 2000, Congress passed the Code Talkers Recognition Act, awarding congressional gold and silver medals to every Navajo who had served in the program. The ceremony was solemn and understated, much like the men themselves. When one veteran was asked how it felt to receive the medal so late, he simply replied, "I didn't do it for medals. I did it because I was a Marine." Even decades after the war, the Code Talkers maintained their humility. They had fought not for fame or reward, but because they believed in duty to their people and to their country. For them, language had never been just words. It had been the heartbeat of their ancestors, the sound of survival carried across centuries. Their legacy began to influence more than just military history. Universities established programs dedicated to native linguistics. The Smithsonian and the Pentagon both hosted permanent exhibits telling their story. Films and documentaries, some dramatized, others purely historical, brought their voices to global audiences. The impact rippled beyond America. Linguists and military scholars from Japan, Germany, and France studied the Navajo system, calling it a masterpiece of natural encryption. No computer had ever achieved what they had done with memory, intuition, and trust. But the greatest monument to their legacy was not cast in bronze or written in books. It lived in the revival of native tongues across North America. The Code Talkers had proven that language was not a relic of the past. It was a weapon of survival and a bridge to the future. From the Lakota Plains to the Cherokee Hills, communities began teaching their children the words their grandparents had been forbidden to speak. By the early 21st century, only a handful of Code Talkers were still alive. Each year, fewer remained. They traveled when they could, spoke softly when invited, and always ended their talks with the same message: that courage has many forms, and silence can be one of them. When the last of them passes, their code will remain, not in secrecy but in spirit. It will live in every voice that refuses to be forgotten. The Unbreakable Code was never just about words. It was about identity, endurance, and the quiet strength of a people who gave their nation something it could never repay. They spoke a language the world once tried to erase, and in doing so, they made sure it would never be lost again. When the radios finally went silent and the last transmission faded into the static of time, the voices of the Navajo Code Talkers remained, not in sound but in legacy. Their words had crossed oceans, guided fleets, and saved lives. Yet their greatest victory was not on the battlefield. It was in proving that the voice of a people can outlast war itself. For centuries, the Navajo had been told that their language was a barrier to progress, something to be forgotten, hidden, or replaced. But in the world's darkest hour, that same language became the light. It carried strength through chaos, meaning through noise, and identity through fire. The Japanese never broke their code because it was never just a code. It was culture, memory, and rhythm. It was the sound of a nation that survived everything the world tried to take from it. When the Code Talkers returned home, they did not speak of glory. They spoke of duty. They had given their words to history and asked for nothing in return. But history eventually spoke back. Today, their story stands as one of the rare truths of war. That victory is not only won with power, but with understanding. Not only with steel, but with voice. The world remembers their silence. It remembers their courage. And somewhere in the wind, across the red canyons of the Southwest, their words still echo. Unbroken, eternal, and free.